Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see faces. For those of you who have chosen to turn on your video today, welcome. Welcome to all of our battery members, our battery powered members, women of the battery, and all of our special guests tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really delighted to have you. My name is Colleen Gregerson. I am the executive director at Battery Powered, and it is my honor to be hosting and moderating this event tonight. California's Feminist Financial Future is the event that you've joined this evening. So I hope that's what you were planning on, because that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I wanted to start just a little bit by talking about how this event came to be. Over the past several months, Battery Powered has been working on the issue of economic inequality and how that inequality has played out in times of COVID. Like we do for all of our themes that we work on, as we dive into that issue, we start doing a lot of research in order to really shape our giving theme for that quarter. We do tons of expert interviews. I mean, we talk to dozens and dozens of people, and I often say that that's the best part of my job, is that I get to talk to amazing and extraordinary people doing real deep thinking on these issues and amazing work. And one of those conversations that we had was with our friends at the Women's Foundation of California. We got to talking, and in the conversation, they mentioned feminist financial future. And I was like, hold on, what is that? I want to learn more about that. I want to hear more about that. And how do we have, what is a feminist future? How do we create that? And as we got to talking more about it and they were educating me more about that, I thought, there's a lot more people in our community at the Battery and Battery Powered and Women of the Battery that should be part of this conversation and that I think would really like to talk about this topic. And so that's how, together with the Women's Foundation of California, we came to be sitting here tonight and having this event. So just a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce you all to our amazing experts tonight. We are in the Zoom meeting mode, which means that if you care to turn on your video, we will see your faces, but no obligation to do so. You are muted so that we can be sure to hear our experts clearly, but you have the chance to unmute yourself during the question and answer period. We will be doing audience questions, so please, all the questions that pop up as you're hearing from these folks, you can do it one of two ways. You can pop it into the chat function in Zoom, or when we get to the Q&A part, you can also use the raise hand function. And my colleague Jill Minkus will be facilitating that and call on you. You can ask your question directly yourself. We'll also use the chat function for any links maybe that folks mention or info that folks mention that you all might be interested in diving into more. We'll put those in there. You can also feel free to use it for reactions, although we ask you to be respectful, like I know our community always is. So that's it for housekeeping, I think. Oh, and we are recording this, so folks who can't join will be able to hear the event. So we knew we had to get an amazing set of women for this special event. And I have to say that I feel like we really knocked it out of the park on this part. And so I'm really delighted to introduce you to the four women that are joining us tonight. I am going to completely not do them justice. They have amazing bios. They've done amazing stuff. And I'm going to say like one or two things about each of them so that we can save most of our time for the conversation tonight. I'm going to start with Serena Khan, who is the CEO of the Women's Foundation of California, which is an organization that invests in, trains, and connects community leaders to advance gender, racial, and economic justice. A first-generation immigrant, she began her tenure at the Women's Foundation of California as a volunteer on the Grants Review Committee. I love that. You now lead the organization that you started as a volunteer with. It's so cool. In other career roles, she was recruited by the Ford Foundation in 2011 to design and launch their LGBT rights initiative, and she went on to become their director in the Democracy, Rights, and Justice program there. Thank you, Serena, for being with us this evening. Next, I want to introduce you to Mary Ignatius. She is the statewide organizer of Parent Voices. a parent-led grassroots organizing effort fighting to make quality childcare accessible and affordable for all families. As the statewide organizer since August of 2005, she coordinates the work of its 13 chapters, and under her tenure has won the most progressive childcare eligibility policies in the nation. Thank you, Mary, from all of us parents. In 2016, she was awarded the Miss Foundation's prestigious Women of Vision Award, and she also sits on the State of California Assembly's Blue Ribbon Commission on Early Care and Education. Thank you, Mary, for being with us tonight. Heather McCulloch is next up. She is the Executive Director of Closing the Women's Wealth Gap, a national initiative dedicated to economic security and dignity for women of color, immigrant women, LGBTQ+, and gender nonconforming people who are most impacted by the intersecting racial and gender wealth gaps. Prior to founding this organization, Heather worked as a speaker, educator, convener, writer, and advocate for policies and strategies to close the wealth gap, including roles at PolicyLink and as a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you, Heather, for being with us. And last but absolutely not least is Sonya Passi, who is the founder and CEO of FreeFrom, a national organization on a mission to create pathways to financial security and long-term safety for survivors of gender-based violence. Before founding FreeFrom, she launched the Family Violence Appellate Project, which is the first and only organization in California to provide pro bono appellate legal services to survivors of intimate partner violence. Sonya was listed, I'm always impressed by this, was listed as Forbes 30 Under 30 class of 2017 for law and policy. And she's also an Ashoka, Roddenberry, Draper Richards Kaplan, and New America California Fellow. She's won all the awards. So welcome, Sonya, and thank you for being with us tonight. So we're going to dive right in, and I would like to actually start at the end. I would like to hear from each one of you four women, what exactly would a feminist financial future look like to each of you? And Serena, could we start with you on that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to Colleen and Jill and the entire team at the Battery for collaborating on this. We're super excited to be with you and to get to know some of you who are on the Zoom this evening. So in terms of what a feminist financial future looks like, part of it is exactly this. It's people from different sectors coming together to really collaborate and think about where we can partner and scale up. And so at Women's Foundation California, we were founded in 1979 and have been really focused ever since then on the health, safety, and economic security of women and girls and gender nonconforming people, trans women, that we all have everything that we need and more. So we're really modeling the feminist future that we need, and that model prioritizes care. It's a model that celebrates our connections and we advocate for income equality, for closing the gender and racial wealth gap, for access to quality education and healthcare, affordable childcare and affordable housing, generous family leave policies, healthy food on our dining tables, feeling safe in our neighborhoods and anywhere that we're going in our communities, and a model that really understands what our founders instilled when they started the foundation, which is that people who are closest to the problems in their communities are also where we see some of the most innovative solutions. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're partnering with people across the state to resource those solutions. The second thing that I want to say is that we really are aligning ourselves with our values. So at the foundation, we partner with a lot of donors and funders in the philanthropic community, and we developed a gender justice impact assessment tool as a way to help anybody who is looking to think about how to look at gender as a central component, whether you're working on addressing poverty. Here we are in California, the wealthiest state in the nation, and yet we have the highest poverty rates in the country, and the majority of people who are living in poverty are women of color and their kids. So we want to make sure that, people are really paying attention to gender. And so this tool allows us, for even us at the foundation, whether it's where we're talking about a feminist financial future, where are we doing our banking? Where are our investments being managed? Who are we making grants to? And where are we supporting women of color-led businesses? So for example, in the time of COVID, we've been sending our staff care packages every month. And what this gender justice impact assessment tool, tells us is that we want to be supporting our grant partners. So one of our care packages was actually from FreeFrom. It was a gratitude package that was made by women of color who are trying to build their assets. And I know that Sonya is going to talk more about that. So it's really about aligning our values in everything that we do. And for us, that is about supporting the leadership of grassroots community leaders. And so I'm so pleased that Mary and her work with Parent Voices and Sonya and her work with FreeFrom both model the kind of leadership that understands that love, safety, justice, and dignity are the unlimited resources that we have access to, and we have to bring that forward.
Thank you, Serena. And you mentioned Sonya, and so I want to actually go to you next, Sonya, and ask you the same question. What exactly does a feminist financial future look like for you and your work?
Sure. So my work is at the intersection of intimate partner violence and economic security. And the 1 in 4 women, 1 in 2 trans folks in the US will experience intimate partner violence. When you're talking about numbers like that, you're talking about a systemic problem. And the number one obstacle to survivor safety is financial insecurity. And we talk a lot about physical abuse. We talk a lot about psychological abuse. What we don't talk about is economic abuse. And economic abuse can look like anything from not being allowed to work, not having access to your own bank accounts, having credit cards and debt in your name that you don't even know about, having your spending monitored, having to account for every cent that you spend. And this happens in 99% of all intimate partner violence cases. And it expands beyond that. There was actually a study done recently that found that 44% of women in community colleges have experienced economic abuse. So it wasn't even a question about have you experienced intimate partner violence. And I think what that says to us is that economic abuse expands beyond what we traditionally understand as intimate partner violence. To me, a feminist financial future is one where economic abuse doesn't occur. And that's not to say that people become better people. It's to say that we understand how this happens and how it thrives. And all of our institutions are taking accountability for that. Our banks have measures in place to prevent economic abuse. Our credit card companies do, our credit reporting agencies do. Federal, state, city, local governments are understanding the economic causes and consequences of intimate partner violence and drafting legislation to prevent it and to really support survivors in being able to thrive. And very much at the center of everything we do is the belief that the way to end intimate partner violence in this country is to invest in survivors. So there's a very close link in my mind between ending intimate partner violence and creating a feminist financial future.
Thank you, Sonya. And I'm looking forward to diving into that a bit more throughout the discussion. But I do want to turn, Mary, if I could go to you next. And if you could lay out your vision for a feminist financial future. And I know that childcare has got to be a part of that. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Good evening, everybody. And first, I just got to say hi to my girl Rose in Chicago. I was so happy to see her face pop up. We work together on some national parent organizing efforts. So to me, well, I'm Mary Ignatius. I'm the statewide organizer of Parent Voices. We really believe in centering the experiences of mothers, of low-income mothers, of mothers of color, that their expertise in understanding how to navigate different systems and how to remove the obstacles and barriers to accessing these systems, that once we actually listen to them and see them as experts, that is going to open the door for all of us. So sometimes we talk about universality and we talk about how do we create a system that works for all, until we actually start with who has the hardest, greatest, deepest, all of the obstacles and barriers, and we remove all of those so they get in the door first. That's when we're going to have a feminist future where everybody gets through the door. That future to me looks like true liberation. It feels joyful, it feels balanced, it feels stable. It's when we have true reproductive choice, when we want to have families, and when we do have them, that we are housed, that we have access to quality, affordable health care. Serena mentioned paid family leave, that it's 100% of your paycheck that you have for a year. And then, of course, my baby is like, what does access to quality, affordable childcare really look like? Because I believe a feminist future means that every person gets to walk out the door to share their talents and their contributions and their abilities with all of us, because they know that their children are safe. They know that the provider, the childcare provider, the early educator, the brain architect who's supporting them while they go to work is paid with wages that commiserate with the dignity of the work that they do. They're not being paid less than dog walkers. They're actually being paid as brain architects, because that's when brain development actually happens. And yet we're paying them poverty wages. And this is mostly a women of color and an immigrant women workforce. And so all of those things, I believe, give us all the freedom to both be able to parent with dignity and be able to also share our talents with the world, and not have to make a decision about which one of those we want to do.
Thank you so much, Mary. I will forever now use brain architect instead of childcare provider. I think we're all being asked to be more of our children's brain architect these days. I'm not sure I'm up for the task, frankly, but really valuing those people for what the actual work that they're doing. Yeah, thumbs up. Agreed. Heather, to you, your picture of a feminist financial future.
Great. So I too was going to say hi to Rose, and I didn't know you two knew each other, so that's awesome. Rose is one of our partners in Chicago. But so hi everyone, I'm so glad to be here. I'm always so humbled to present with this crew, because we do speak a lot at different events, and Serena is one of our founding partners. So yeah, I'm so glad you guys are hosting this. So just to remind everyone, so we are a national, multiracial, multi-network, ethnic, cross-sectoral network. We have folks from the public, private, nonprofit, and nonprofit sectors, advocates, organizers, the Federal Reserve. It's a very diverse group of folks. And what we do is we're really focused on transforming public policies and systems that help to build and advance gender economic equity. And as Colleen mentioned when she was giving my bio, like, we really focus on the intersecting racial and gender wealth gap. And we believe that and it's so nice to follow Mary, because she just explained all this, that we believe that in order to really build women's economic security, that we have to get rid of the barriers and the systems that aren't working for those folks that are most impacted. So we really focus on women of color, immigrant women, women who are LGBTQ, and gender nonconforming. So I just want to say, like, I love this framing, because I realize we're always so focused on the problems and the issues and the data, and it's all so depressing right now. So it's just so fun to be able to step back and go like, yeah, what would the world look like if it could be as I dream it to be? So we actually had gone through this exercise recently with our staff because we've been just really rethinking, who we are, what we do in the wake of COVID. And so I just want to share with you some of the things that came up in our discussion. So we weren't calling it a feminist financial future, but I love that terminology. So we would envision a feminist future as one where all women have economic security, self-determination, and power. They would have a financial cushion to make it through economic crises like a divorce, a job loss, a sick loved one that they have to care for. They would have resources to invest in themselves and their children. They could buy a home. They could start their dream business. They could pay for their child's education or special education if they needed to. They'd be able to care for the loved ones in their life it's not if, but when those needs arise. And they would have enough savings to retire with dignity and security. Finally, they would be able to end their lives with funds to pass on to their kids and their grandkids. So they too have a cushion to start with. It would be a world where women not only hold positions of power and leadership, but where they also have time to enjoy their lives and nurture the things that they love. And finally, it'd be a world where everyone's valued and treated with respect, regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation or identity, or their legal status. So I just thought I would share that with you because it seems like we're all trying to create space to have this vision so that we know what we're working towards. So I'll stop there.
No, that's great, Heather. And I agree. We very purposely wanted to kind of frame this from the end goal and where we want to go and what's possible. But we can't just skip over the where we are now piece, which might be less optimistic or inspiring at the moment. But I do think it's important that if we know where we want to go, we have to know where we are now so we can chart the path to get from here to there. And if you don't mind, Heather, I actually want to start with you on this question. Could you paint a picture for how far away from that ideal future we are, and what that kind of gap, the gender wealth gap, looks like right now? You and I had a conversation a couple months ago, and you really blew my mind with some of the data that you shared, and I'd love for you to share some of that with our audience tonight.
Okay, so am I on? You can hear me. So before the crisis, we were making slow but steady progress. So women were the majority of the civilian workforce for only the second time in our history. They were earning advanced degrees, starting businesses at a faster rate than men. And women of color were starting businesses and earning degrees at a faster rate than white men and white women. We were more likely to be breadwinners and caregivers than ever before. So that meant we really were a linchpin in our family's economic security. And 4 out of 5 Black mothers, 2 out of 3 of all mothers were key breadwinners in their households. So household economic security was pretty much a function of women's ability to work, earn wages, and contribute to or be the sole source of income for the family. At the same time, low-income women, and especially women of color, were extremely financially insecure. So they were disproportionately represented in low-wage sectors, less likely to have access to employer-paid benefits like paid sick leave, health insurance, retirement plans, and they were, as we all know, we were facing a pay gap and a wealth gap. So we all know women earn about 80 cents on the dollar compared to men. And for Black and Latinx women, that's about 63 cents and 54 cents, respectively. But what we never talk about is that there's also a women's wealth gap, and it has different drivers, and it's much more severe than the income gap. So for single Black and Latinx women, they own less than a penny on the dollar compared to white men and white women. So that's kind of, I hate to say it, but that's where we were before COVID hit. So then COVID hits. Since then, women of color have been hit the hardest on every front. They've lost jobs at a higher rate than white men and white women, partly because they've been disproportionately represented in the sectors that were hit first and hardest, so hospitality, retail, restaurant workers. And even though as a nation, we've recovered about half the jobs, the benefits of that are really uneven. So the unemployment rate for Black and Latinx women remains about 50% higher than for white women. And we're also seeing this new phenomenon that women are dropping out of the workforce at a higher rate than ever. So you all may have seen almost 1 million women dropped out in September alone. And of those, almost half were Black and Latinx women. So we're basically seeing this point in time where we are farther from that vision than we've ever been. We're in a crisis, but every crisis has opportunities. So we can talk about that a little bit, but I'll stop.
Yeah, absolutely. We will definitely talk about the opportunities, but I want to kind of follow up with Mary on that very issue, because you mentioned that I think it was about 1 million women are dropping out of the workforce, and as I understand of that, a lot of that is attached to the brand new responsibilities that we have around school and the challenges around lack of childcare. So, Mary, I thought you could speak a bit more to that for us.
Yeah, I would, similarly to how Heather described it, I mean, prior to both the public health and economic crisis that the nation's facing, childcare was already struggling to be really seen as the public good that it is. It has really been seen as this individual problem you kind of have to figure out. Except that we don't say that when a child goes to kindergarten. We have a whole system and infrastructure to help families figure it out. We don't have that when you go back to work and need to put your child somewhere. So we already had, they call them childcare deserts, where in rural communities and also even in urban communities, you just don't have the supply because we haven't really made it a lucrative job, especially when we're asking women to have these poverty wages where they can't even afford to put food on their own table to care for other children. The cost of childcare, as many of you may know, exceeds almost the cost of housing in almost every state. It exceeds the cost of a 4-year college education, and you have 18 years to kind of save for college. You have like 18 minutes to save for childcare. So the cost is exorbitant. In California, we had 2 million children who are eligible for childcare. We're only serving 1 in 8, 1 in 9. So it was already a crisis. And COVID has only now, I think what COVID has done is actually turned a crisis into opportunity. I think we've heard a lot about childcare, more than we've ever heard really before. Presidential candidates have whole plans on childcare and a care economy from birth to caring for our elder relatives. And we're also seeing providers without some kind of federal bailout like the airlines received, where 50% of them have closed. So where we already had a very low supply, now that's only been exacerbated. And as schools have closed, it's been childcare providers who've been on the front lines who are now taking in and supporting the distance learning needs of school-aged children, but again, have not gotten the sort of relief, whether it's financial, whether it's hazard pay, whether it's PPE equipment. And so we are hoping that, I think for a lot of families who are distance learning in the K through 12 system, also kind of see K through 12 as a quasi childcare system, and kind of really now appreciate and recognize the role that childcare and education plays in our lives. So we are hopeful that we are going to get the relief that we need soon. But it's taken time, and I think the racist history of our childcare system, from slavery to excluding childcare work and domestic work in labor standards, And this idea that childcare is just babysitting, like we are coming off of a long history of devaluing care, devaluing women's work. And we are hopeful that 2020 and beyond, there will be a cultural shift there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marian. And I want to, next, I definitely want to get into that more, like how do we overcome that? It is a very long and entrenched history, and how do we overcome that, and what kind of opportunity is created from this crisis to do so. But before we get to that, Sonya, I wanted to come back to you, because one of the issues that I felt like I heard a lot about in the beginning when COVID started was the impact for those who are living in a domestic abuse situation. But I feel like that fell off the radar, at least in kind of the mainstream media. And I would really love to hear from you, what the impact of COVID has been for the kinds of communities that you work with, vis-a-vis that, that beautiful future that you laid out as the ideal.
Sure, yeah. Similar to Mary, to sum up my response, it was really bad before, and it's worse now, but there's a window of opportunity. I mentioned before that 99% of survivors will experience economic abuse. In addition to that, the CDC estimates that intimate partner violence will cost a female survivor an average of $104,000. And we spent some time this year surveying 1,300 survivors across 36 states and Puerto Rico, and really got to kind of understand even deeper what those costs look like. So survivors have an average of $1,300 stolen from them each month by their harm doer. Harm doers incur roughly $16,000 in fraudulent debt in survivors' names each year. Survivors incur about $18,000 in property damages every year as a result of the abuse. And when you start to add all these numbers up, you really understand just how expensive this is. And we live in a society where we expect survivors to leave, and we assume that if they don't, they are either weak or bad decision makers or in love. And we're completely missing this structural economic piece of the problem. And this was pre-COVID. This data didn't happen because of COVID. And then, of course, COVID happened, and we heard a number of stories from survivors about how the harm was exacerbated. Losing their source of income made them potentially have to go back to the abuse or stay in the abuse longer than they would like to. But what happened at the beginning of COVID is our society shut down. And what we all became acutely aware of was that the very few kind of scraps of services that we had to address intimate partner violence were not enough. Because when COVID happened, shelters closed, courts closed, and that was basically all we had for survivors. We have shelters, we have restraining orders, we have access to public assistance. And what I see in this year is a very real window of opportunity to build the infrastructure that survivors actually need, to bring in all different pillars of our society to be accountable for this problem, not just a very small group of underfunded, under-resourced domestic violence shelters. And I think what we're also hearing from survivors and kind of using that data to make the case for is we, as a society, think about intimate partner violence as happening in days, minutes, weeks. Survivors think of intimate partner violence as happening in months, years, and generations. And the solutions that we have are providing support at that moment of acute crisis when the financial impact has already been compounded to a point of devastation. We provide services for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, and then you're supposed to figure out the rest on your own. And some of the stories we're hearing from survivors is, I thought this was going to be the year that I left. And one person shared that pre-COVID, every day when her harm doer went to work, she would go out and she would bake cookies and cupcakes, go out and sell them, pocket the money, and she was actually keeping the money at a friend's house, come home, clean the kitchen, no one was any the wiser. And then COVID happened and our harm doer was staying home, and that could no longer happen. And so she said, I thought 2020 was going to be the year. Hopefully 2021 will be the year. And to really understand, one, how strategic survivors are and how survivors survive, and to understand the very, very real economic barriers, I think there is the opportunity to do that this year, as we're all getting a taste of what it is to be trapped at home, and opening and kind of expanding our empathy for people for whom that is their lived experience, pandemic or no pandemic.
Yeah. And thank you, Sonya, for talking about, like, okay, 2021, is this the year where we're going to build that infrastructure? I'd like to actually turn to that very point. And Serena, maybe I can start with you, is, what is that pathway? What are the opportunities, and what is the concrete pathway to get us from where we are now, which, as I understand from all of you, we've slid back from the situation where, how do we gain that back, but then also move forward into that future that you all so nicely laid out for us in the beginning?
Yeah, I really appreciate Mary and Heather and Sonya, all of you really talking about the opportunity, because I really do believe that in crisis there is opportunity. And this is, as Mary and others pointed out, that this pandemic has really amplified everything that was wrong in our communities prior to the pandemic. So we don't want to go back to that normal. We want to build a new normal. And we can do that. That means that we can be creative and think about what kinds of systems need to be redesigned, what kinds of systems need to be restructured. And we have to address what has been a historic lack of investment in women, particularly women of color. When the Women's Foundation California was founded in the 70s, our founders, noticed that only 1% of funding was going specifically to women and girls. And if you look at funding then that's specifically going to gender justice and systems change, it's even less. And that has only inched up to like 1.7% in 4 decades. So excluding women, particularly women of color, from decision-making processes and solutions, whether it's legislation or innovation, has left our voices out and increased inequity. And I think there's plenty of research and anecdotal evidence that shows when you put women in leadership positions, whatever sector that's in, your outcomes and productivity is going to be better. Your solutions, your policies, your practices, and women are really underrepresented in every sector, whether it's where I work in philanthropy. There are very few women in CEO positions, leadership positions, and fewer women of color. That's true in the healthcare industry, media, entertainment, banking, you name it. And so part of it is really investing in women. And we have seen that firsthand at the Women's Foundation California. I do believe, despite all the challenges that we're seeing, that California is the leader in the nation because of the work of the community leaders that we have been investing in. So if you look at our Women's Policy Institute, which is a year-long experiential program that trains community leaders about how the public policy process works, because that's another very important system that we are excluded from. It's very hard to even know how to walk around, where to go, how to navigate the Capitol, let alone how a bill becomes law. And I remember, a few years ago, Mary came to us and said, we want to run a team of childcare advocates through the Women's Policy Institute. And they were successful in increasing access to subsidized childcare by recognizing that people who are taking English as a second language or trying to get their high school degree, that is now recognized as a form of job training. And those parents can access subsidized childcare. So those are the kinds of innovative solutions. And we've trained, 600, almost 600 leaders. Each one of those is connected to thousands of people. So this is what gives me hope, and I think is our pathway to opportunity, which is that we can activate in California now millions of people just through this one network, the Women's Policy Institute network, or, Mary and the Women's Foundation team has really been involved in the Stronger California network. We are banding together and building coalitions in California, and coming up, we've laid out the vision for what a feminist financial future looks like. And I think we know how to get there. And so what we need is to be investing in our communities, because they have, for example, the Women's Foundation Policy Institute has, the teams, the leaders have passed 47 pieces of legislation in these past 18 years. And that has been about putting a stop to 100,000 years of incarceration, ensuring access to medical abortion at all of California's publicly funded universities, putting warm food on the table for the disabled, elderly, and folks experiencing homelessness. And so, I really think that is the solution, because we have the vision, and you're getting a glimpse, a snapshot of the kinds of leaders in Mary and Sonya, and the way Heather has so, expertly convened a national network of people who are working together. So it really is about partnership, and for us to, come together across our sectors and be supportive, because we know what the solutions are, and we know who the leaders are who can, get us there. But the key is investments.
Yeah, thanks for that, Serena. And we're going to turn to audience Q&A in just another couple of minutes. So get your questions ready. You can put them in the chat function, or you can raise hands once we get to it, but we'll be getting to you in just a minute. I just wanted to get the other three women's thoughts on top priorities for top thoughts about our pathway forward and what we need to do. But also, could you say something about how our audience might get engaged in charting this path forward as well? Because I think we have some really engaged folks on the line that would love to hear about that. And Heather, maybe I'll go to you next, and then I'll turn to Sonya and Mary.
Yeah, well, why don't I start with how you all can get engaged, because I'll forget to answer it otherwise. But you are totally welcome to join our network. What's really exciting about it to me is that we have people coming from so many different walks of life and so many different sectors. And that's really been deliberate. I mean, Serena and I have been involved in this from the very early days. And we realized this, the gender wealth gap, the intersecting gender and racial wealth gap took centuries to build. There's the reason women of color have so little wealth to start with is because of our nation's long history of slavery, Jim Crow, racially restrictive covenants, etc. So that's really stripped women of wealth. And then so many laws that excluded women from higher education, from accessing credit, business loans, etc. So we really recognize that to fix this, it's going to take a ton of work, and it's going to take champions in all different sectors doing what they do best. So we do a lot of work convening people, strategizing, brainstorming, learning who's doing what. And so I just invite all of you, if you want to learn more about it, just, you could get my number from Colleen. I usually do an in-depth call with all of our new members. We really grow through word of mouth, but our job is to figure out how to connect people, how to bring people in, and then how to help people to, move forward to make change together. But to the bigger question about, what is the pathway? I just wanted to say, my biggest aha since I got into this work is the realization that we don't see women's role in our economy, in our society, in all of it. We don't see the economic value of it. We talk about women's issues, we talk about care, childcare and paid leave, and these issues that support women as workers as if they're separate issues. Those are women's issues. But we're really trying to shift the conversation so that we really center women, and especially women of color, in our economic dialogue. We know, as I said, women are the drivers of household financial security. They're key contributors to our national and state economic growth. We as a nation have actually peaked in terms of women's labor force participation. And some of our private sector partners at S&P Global have been, quantifying what that costs us as an economy. So there's a huge economic cost. I mean, I encourage you to go to hashtag change pays to see their research from their campaign, but they've even quantified like the costs to the global stock market. So what we're really moving on in this next year is to center women of color in economic policy discussions. And the way we do it is we just ask a really simple question. If we're talking about economic policy, tax code, regulation of financial services, Federal Reserve policy, we just ask, do women of color benefit? And if the answer is no, then we all have to be working to change it. We have to lift up the problems with that. At the same time, we're really investing in moving forward on what some of our partners at Caring Across Generations have named the care infrastructure. So we're galvanizing all of our partners to support a national campaign next year that will really focus on moving federal policies to support women in their dual roles as caregivers and breadwinners.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. I really want to make sure that we leave space for audience questions. So I actually want to turn to that now. I of course have lots more questions that I can get to all of you, but why don't we do that? And Jill, you had offered to be my audience Q&A manager, so I'll turn it to you.
Absolutely. So as Colleen mentioned, if any of you has a question, there's two ways you can share it with us. You can raise your hand virtually and we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself, maybe put yourself on video and give us a chance to see and hear you, or you can pop your question into the chat box. So I'm going to take a quick scan of the participant list. I don't see any raised hands right now, but I see, honestly, this is such a fantastic question. I almost feel like I should save it for last. So I see it, but I'm going to ask another question first, which I think each of you is going to have something to say about, but Serena, you might be the best person to start this, which is, Serena, you mentioned that people on the ground know what the solutions are. And, when people are trained in policy and in advocacy, they're passing legislation, like they're making policy change happen. So can each of you really tell us a little bit, one or two of the kinds of policy solutions that you're actually seeing winning or gaining traction statewide, since this is about California's feminist future, or locally? But I am going to make sure we keep 5 minutes for Kat's most excellent last question.
Yeah, I really want to answer that question. So make sure you come back to me on the $50 million. So yeah, I mean, we have so many examples of policies that have been passed at a statewide level. Some of the ones I mentioned, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, for example, is another one here in terms of the care economy. We have, a bill that was led by trans women in our policy institute that we believe is the first time in the country that a bill was authored by currently and formerly incarcerated trans people that now allows them to change their gender markers or names while they're in the, criminal justice system. And then, I'm really inspired by the work of the Stronger California Network of different coalitions banding together and coordinating their policy change. So I would just like to turn it over to Mary to talk a little bit about that work, because this year in particular, which is a very difficult year legislatively, given the pandemic and the limitations of, physical and otherwise, that many pieces of legislation, the governor asked, can we please focus on things that are really directly related to the pandemic. And the work of the Stronger California, those bills were all related to economic stability, which is directly related to the health of our communities. So there's a lot of potential there.
I think one of the biggest bills that passed that really required so many different coalitions to come together and push the legislature was the job protection bill for paid family leave. It was, it's the idea that, okay, we have a paid family leave program in California, but if you take it, you could be at risk of losing your job. So many families were not accessing the program. This was a bill that we've been trying to pass for forever, I think since the first bill passed in 2002. And it's always been on the Chamber of Commerce's job killer list. Moderate Dems have always voted against it. And through perseverance, through this collection of groups, through the Stronger California Network, it passed. And it passed by one vote. And they say that that one vote really happened in the Central Valley in Fresno with one of the assembly members, and there were parents from our group and other groups who were really holding him accountable and saying, like, you are a father, you are a pediatrician, why wouldn't you support this bill? And he was the 41st one to pass it. Yeah, it was really, I mean, it's incredible. And just really quickly, because of everything that Sonya's doing, you know, because of the COVID pandemic and recognizing the unique needs of domestic violence survivors, we created a new childcare program for essential workers. And we also made sure that specific women who were experiencing crisis, including domestic violence survivors, families experiencing homelessness, and children with special needs could also qualify for this new child care subsidy program. And so it's when we listen to our members and really hear what they need, we can turn those into solutions. I'll stop there.
It's incredible. I had just one to add, which is it's federal, but it certainly impacts California. We have been doing a lot of work around banks and getting banks involved in being part of the solution to intimate partner violence. This is building on work that's already been happening in other countries, in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand. And we created earlier this year 11 guidelines for banks on what they can do to ensure that customers who experience intimate partner violence have safe access to their bank accounts. We estimate that 28.5 million survivors in the US are underbanked because they don't have safe access to their own accounts. And so we've been working, we've kind of got a dual, triple, all strategies approach to this. One is working with banks, but we're actually in the process right now of working with Maxine Waters' office to turn those guidelines into federal legislation. And when we look at kind of the biggest precedent for this is elder abuse. Elder abuse was kind of not talked about, and now almost every bank has a division that deals with elder abuse, and folks are trained on elder abuse. That all came about after signaling legislation from the federal government. So we're hoping to kind of follow in those footsteps and bring in this other giant pillar of our society to take accountability for this societal problem.
Jill, I think you're muted.
No, not anymore. So Michael, did you have a question? We saw your hand go up.
Yes, I did. First, I'd just like to say I feel very fortunate to be in the company of all these really smart people doing just amazing work. And so thank you all. Since it takes, and so much of the focus here is about caring for families and for children. And even one of the speakers talked about a parent network, is that at conception, there's a certain equity. It takes a sperm and an egg to make a baby. And yet in all of these conversations, there seems to be so little focus on, well, what is the men's role in all of this? Because I happen to believe that they're actually a significant part of the solution and the problem. I mean, but we rarely talk about, I rarely see the role of men in the solutions list. Way more government and community focus, and that's great too. We need those, takes a village. But the person that contributed to the creation, and just what is the focus there, and or what could be my role? I mean, or what message is there to the other parent part of the equation? And because I think that's really a missing resource in all of this. So.
Thank you, Michael. All right, I'm going to kick it out to you. Who would like to take that one on first?
I'm happy to respond. I really appreciate, Michael, you bringing that up, because at Women's Foundation California, we really believe that men have to be part of the solution, that we won't achieve gender equity and gender justice without the meaningful participation of men. And so one of the ways, it's maybe a small way that we do that, is with intention, we include men on our board of directors. And so that what we need is, we haven't talked much about the culture change that we need. And so we need men to be part of the solution. We need men to be strong feminists and championing women and championing feminist solutions.
And I'll also jump in to just basically reinforce what Serena just said. And thank you, Michael, for your question. We too have men that are allies in our work. And I feel like it's been amazing because they play such an important role. But I really think the key word is allyship, like helping us to translate this issue to other men so that they can hear it, writing about the issue, speaking about the issue, talking about why gender equity and gender economic equity specifically is so important, not just for women and children, but for everyone, for our nation's economy, and why policies like having a strong care infrastructure matter for all families. I mean, again, like COVID is helpful because it's making the case for us, but just being out there and really being, especially with other white men, being the face out there to say, I'm one of you and this is why it's important. But thank you.
I would just quickly add, I think it's also our role and responsibility to raise whole beings and whole men who are also at very young ages exposed to trauma and the inability to express emotion and to feel and to have to bottle everything up. Like, I have 2 sons. It feels like such a huge responsibility that I have to raise men who are going to be whole, who are going to be loved and allow themselves to love. And I just think the earlier we start that and incorporate that wholeness from the very beginning, the better we're going to get to that future we all need.
Thank you all.
Wonderful. Well, we're close to the end time, but I think we need to go out with a bang. So I would love to ask each of you very quickly. Sonya, maybe you can start. How would you strategically invest $50 million? Blue sky.
So I mentioned earlier, we surveyed 1,300 survivors. And the number one need that survivors expressed was cash to spend as they need. And we actually used this year, we were able to get 1,300 grants out to survivors across the country. And if we got $50 million, we'd give it all to survivors and trust them to solve the problems that they're facing.
Well, I'm itching to get in on this one if I can.
I know you are.
So I'll just say thank you for the question, Kat. And we have an abundance mindset at the Women's Foundation California. So very early in the pandemic, our director of community investment, who's here, Hung Nguyen Yap, said, when we said we have to start working at home, she said, well, can we give supplemental support to our grant partners because they may not have Zoom memberships or laptops? And so that was the genesis of our Relief and Resilience Fund. And then we saw the spikes in interpersonal violence, and we partnered with Blue Shield of California Foundation to get grants out the door to every single domestic violence shelter in the state of California. That's more than 130 organizations in a matter of weeks, because the demand was increasing, but the physical needs, because of physical distancing, they had actually less space. And so and then, with the fires, we increased our grants to environmental justice organizations, to Black-led organizations, Black women-led organizations, and in terms of the epidemic of racial injustice in this country. So we have, and then we caught the eye of the governor's office, who said, can we enter into a public-private partnership with this Relief and Resilience Fund? And we actually came up to a $50 million goal. And so we're going to raise that money to get it out into the solutions that we know are already working. In terms of what Sonya has said, we will give it to survivors, we will give it to community-based leaders, we will train our policy advocates. And then finally, I'll just end on the note that we have this amazing program, the Women's Policy Institute, and I would love, I mean, I think with a $50 million investment to replicate it across the country and have a movement of women leaders, community-based leaders who are changing laws and policies in their own communities. Somebody said to me the other day, well, what about states that aren't as progressive as California? And I said, California was not always progressive. We made it that way. So we can do it in other parts of the country as well.
Thank you, Serena. It is a little past 7, so Colleen, I think it's time to kick it back to you. I could listen to this all night, but I think it's time to kick it back to you for our wrap up.
Agree, but you know what, Mary, I really want to hear what you do with $50 million. Can you give us the 30-second answer?
I'm just going to sum it up. I think funding women of color-led grassroots organizing in California and across the nation is what's going to transform everything, where we center the needs of women and children and trust us that we bring everybody along with us. So
nice. And Heather, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't give you your 30 seconds to say what you do with 50 million before we tie up.
Oh, I just was like, here on what Mary just said. I was just going to say, do not forget the organizing and the advocacy. That's the most important thing right now, because we can't solve this with just donations. And like if someone put 50 million in, that'd be fantastic. But this is such a huge problem. So we need advocates to be pushing for policy change. We need folks like Mary at the state level, like, because we have to have public investment to change our system.
Well, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Mary and Serena and Sonya and Heather, thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience and time with us. I think we've all learned a lot. To our audience, thank you so much. There are 1,000 things you could have been doing at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and we are so pleased that you decided to spend some of that time with us tonight. Thank you all. Stay healthy, stay well. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.